Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future, the History of Ideas podcast. Today's episode in our series about ideas of globalisation is about one decade, the 1970s, a decade of political and economic shocks that transformed America's sense of its place in the world. I'm talking to the economic historian Meg Jacobs, author of Panic at the Pump, The Energy Crisis and the Transformation of American Politics in the 1970s, about what happened in that decade and how it shaped not just America, but one American in particular, Donald J. Trump. Meg, when I think about the 1970s and America's understanding of its place in the world, I think of the two big shocks that are associated with that decade relatively early in the decade, one at the beginning, one a little later on, the Nixon Shock and the oil shock. So maybe we could use them just to frame this story. And some people may not be familiar with the Nixon Shock. I think the oil shock still resonates. I think people know what we're talking about. But if we start with the Nixon Shock in 1971, just remind us what it was, but also, in a way, why it was so shocking. I mean, why it got the name of a shock. Was it a real shock to the American political system and to the wider public?
Well, in my mind, in a certain way, you talk of two shocks, and that's fair. But I think of the whole decade of the 1970s as defined by a single crisis, that is the energy crisis. That is what loomed large for all Americans. And that term crisis was one that was used at the time, was not inevitably to be used, but was used in the time. So both of what you mentioned, in my mind, are sort of overshadowed and yet connected. When Nixon runs for office in 1968, he is absolutely determined that the economy not be a problem for him. He is certain that he lost in 1960 to JFK because of a recession, and he was determined to never have that happen to him again. And in addition, what Nixon had, what made Nixon the kind of politician that he was, is he did have a sort of gut sense of how economic issues played for the American people. So when he decides to deviate from the global order that America had been part of since the end of World War II, the main thing on his mind was not closing the gold window or anything really having to do with international political economy. The main thing that I see that he was concerned about was the rising prices of goods, because he understood that to be a core gut issue for the American public. And so what defined the Nixon shock, I believe, as you're talking about it, was when he interrupted evening programming in America to announce that he was imposing price controls, which seemed shocking to us sitting here in 2025, because how could that be an American thing to do? How could that be a Nixonian thing to do? Nixon started his career running for office in 1946, and he ran against the World War II Office of Price Administration, which he was briefly worked for in the tire rationing department. And he thought that large government programs of all sorts, especially price controls, were fundamentally un-American, had the ring of or the flavor or taste of sort of communism, which he was opposed to. And he promised that he would never, when he ran in 1946, he ran against price controls. And then for the rest of his career, up until that moment, he said it was a tool that he would never use. Now, what makes that moment interesting for Nixon is why he did it. And the reason why he did it is, if he did have a gut sense of what Americans wanted, he was also skillful because he was incredibly opportunistic about what he was willing to do. And in that moment, what he was willing to do was use this tool, this device, to keep a lid on prices because he believed that's what Americans wanted.
When you read the speech, so I reread the speech, and a few things stand out, one of which is it's pretty heavy stuff to come and break up, the evening TV shows, for him to come on. We're used to presidential addresses being a little bit more accessible. This one's quite policy heavy, and there's a lot that he's announcing. So as you say, he announces the end of gold convertibility, essentially the end of the Bretton Woods arrangement. He blames speculators. So there's a lot, if he identifies an enemy in this, it's the international speculators. It's the people who are exploiting the system to kind of rip off America by exploiting the fact that America was the anchor for this system. He's very keen to emphasize that devaluing the dollar will not affect the dollar in your pocket. So, Britain had been through a version of this in the late 60s. Politicians always come on when there's been a devaluation and say, it doesn't mean that the purchasing power of your wages has gone down because prices are going to stay the same, or if anything will come down in this country. But the other thing that really stands out, it's got this kind of theme of self-sufficiency running through it. This idea that we're no longer going to be the anchor of the global system so the speculators can exploit us and exploit the gap between what the dollar is kind of worth if it floated and what we say it's worth in the system. We're going to break that system. And in this new world, we're going to have to stand for our own values. And that means we're going to have to be quite self-disciplined. It's quite a stark message, actually, for a politician who understood what voters cared about. They cared about prices. For someone who's doing something that goes against everything that he stood for before. Reading it now, it's very hard to imagine a politician now saying, and by the way, this is on you. You're going to have to show you've got the mettle for this. It feels like it comes from another world, this speech, to me.
Just wait till later in the program when we discuss Carter's crisis of confidence speech. What's very interesting about Nixon and the Nixon administration and the people he puts in charge or around him, and here I'm thinking of William Simon, who he brings in ultimately to deal with the first oil shock in 1973, is that they invoke this language that you have picked up on, one of sort of restraint, discipline, possibly going without, transforming your wasteful ways. That's certainly what William Simon, but they do it for a particular reason. And it's contradictory because this is the moment that he's announcing wage and price controls, but they do it because they don't want wage and price controls. It's a Democratic Congress that has passed a bill that gives Nixon this authority to do it. And he says, no, I'm never going to use it, then feels pressure to use it because he doesn't want inflation to go up. They see self-restraint. If people really could do that, that would mean you would not have to resort to large-scale government interventions.
Yeah, it's a little like COVID, actually. If you remember some of the arguments from people on the right, certainly in the UK, I think maybe in the US as well, lockdown was much more acceptable if somehow they could persuade themselves that this is what people had chosen for themselves because people had a kind of inner resolve or discipline. And there is a little bit of that. I think it is probably the way Nixon tried to square the circle in his own mind, which is, I can come on as a Republican who's always campaigned against this stuff and advocate it, because I'm not actually advocating for more government control. I'm advocating for an idea of America as a proud, strong, confident nation in a dangerous world. And it has that kind of vibe to it, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that one of the most unpopular things that comes out of the 1970s, that when Ronald Reagan, and I know I'm jumping ahead here, but when Ronald Reagan will run, one of the most unpopular things that comes out of the 70s is the national speed limit. And we are talking to each other across the span of an ocean here. So indulge my exaggerations of what American culture is like. The obsession with the American automobile really you can't emphasize that enough, and how important that is and was to the American psyche, especially going into the 1970s. And related to that was this belief, almost a sort of ideological belief, that oil prices would always be cheap, that gas prices at the pump would not even be worth talking about. And that's what sort of literally powered the American fixation with the automobile, which is how we created our entire post-war economy, essentially. And so the kind of restraint self-discipline versus sort of federally imposed restraint sort of played out around the speed limit. And when Ronald Reagan runs, he promises to finally once and for all get rid of the speed limit because it's this totally hated thing that Americans feel, we deserve, we should have. We've always had the open road, the freedom, it's sort of as if you tell people that they have to drive 55 miles per hour and, their American birthright is forfeited or something like this.
But correct me if I'm wrong, he didn't abolish the speed limit.
Right, it was sort of hard to do, but the fact that he feels like that should be a campaign promise, we sort of forget that mentality. And the way that Nixon justifies the speed limit, we can move past the speed limit in a minute, but it's really sort of iconic in a certain way. And the way that Nixon justifies it is, I did this and I saved jobs. So that's the sort of trade-off.
And when did the speed limit come in? The 55, do we know?
I'm pretty sure that would have been in the winter of 73, 74.
We will get past the speed limit, but you say there's an ocean between us. But I remember, so when I was in my 20s, I drove across the States. I rented a car and I drove everywhere. And I come from a country where the speed limit is 70 miles an hour. And when I went through states where it was 55, and it's not 55 everywhere, is it? But went through states where it was 55, I kind of thought, this is really un-American. I can't cope with this. I'm in the United States of America, the land of the car. And I'm going at this, what seemed to me, this incredibly slow speed, as though I was in sort of Central Europe. As a British person, I thought, what's happened to this country?
Imagine if you were American, and there are all of these right on red. I don't know if you have that. In this country where we drive in the right lane, the idea of allowing people to make a right on red is so that you would not have to sort of idle at the light and thereby waste gasoline. So, it's these sort of micro things that get wrapped up. And to your opening question, this is how Americans understand the 1970s through their daily quotidian sort of experiences, either at the pump or in the supermarket, especially around these questions of prices.
So to connect the Nixon shock with the oil shock, you said you see this as part of one big decade-long, in a way, crisis, which is an energy crisis. The Nixon shock, as you described it, was primarily motivated by Nixon's desire not to be undone by inflation. He totally understood the ways in which that was toxic for any incumbent politician. We've seen it in the last 2 or 3 years. Governments around the world can't win election when inflation is high. But the Nixon shock is 1971. The oil shock is 1973. How much in 1971 was this already anxiety about the price of gas, or was it still mainly food, supermarket shock, the price of eggs? We're in a price of eggs moment now.
Price of meat, at the time.
Okay, so price of meat. So in 71, was the connection with the coming energy crisis being made, or is that still to come?
There's two ways of answering your question that I think are both relevant. Just for context here, the energy crisis really was an idea that came about earlier than 71, was first talked about by oil executives who were concerned that it was becoming harder and harder to drill in America. And they had to go deeper and deeper or farther and farther offshore, and it was becoming more and more expensive. And they were warning that unless we can increase the prices, we're going to face an energy shortage. At the same time, what you had is the OPEC countries, Saudi Arabia in particular, saying, we don't like the deal that we have previously had where we don't really control anything. The international major oil companies control. We just sort of let them use our land. And they were becoming more assertive too, doing things like founding OPEC as a way to try to influence the price. So there was already anxiety about whether this regime that had lasted throughout the 20th century of cheap oil was going to persevere. And then you had these more proximate concerns about the price of food and those kinds of commodities. So when Nixon announces price controls in 1971, they're across the board. he just goes for it. It's not sort of sector by sector, and that's what makes them stunning in a certain way because they're so sweeping. A sidebar to this, we should also note, is their wage controls too. So there was a large point of view that it was wages and the power of unions, which were still powerful at that time, that were driving up prices and would lead to inflation. So they're across the board wage and price controls. And that included the oil industry, which then made the oil industry even more anxious that they weren't going to be able to extract more and more, and that we were essentially running out. And this was sort of the fear, and this is what was suggested by the term energy crisis, that America was not going to have cheap oil and cheap oil that they could depend on in the United States.
So it raises that acute question, which is in a way what this series of podcasts that we're doing now is about. How do people understand the relationship of the United States and its economy to the wider world? And that there's a kind of paradox in the first Nixon shock before we get on to the oil shock, which is ending convertibility, closing the gold window, beginning to end the Bretton Woods arrangement on the grounds that it leaves the United States vulnerable. And we're going to have to undo this thing that has underpinned the global economy for a quarter of a century. And so we're going to have to become more self-sufficient because, in a way, by underpinning that global order, we're kind of clearly creating a more volatile world. We're in some ways creating a more unstable international environment. The Bretton Woods arrangement, the point of it was that it was meant to be reliable. And now currencies are going to float. There's not going to be an anchor for this. And it's because of that we're going to have to be more self-sufficient. But it's like Nixon saying, the world is a dangerous place. So in order to make it less dangerous, we're going to make ourselves more vulnerable to it, as a result of which we're going to have to be more self-sufficient. You've got something similar going on with oil. The oil barons are saying, if you want us not to be dependent on imported oil, you're going to have to allow us to raise prices. And Nixon says, no, I'm going to have a price freeze so that we can be more self-sufficient. But it's also going to mean that we're more dependent on imported oil. It feels like there are two things going on in these announcements at the same time.
Yeah, and you said volatile, and I was going to add vulnerable because they sort of go hand in hand. But the element that we haven't talked about, and we should just mention briefly, is what defines the global order at this moment. And of course, that's the Cold War. And as that pertains to oil in particular, what seems unfathomable is that we would be threatened by our Middle Eastern allies at this moment. So Saudi Arabia seemed like an incredibly reliable ally, an anti-Soviet ally that we could depend on. So yes, volatile and vulnerable, but in a world that they believed that the United States exerted a tremendous amount of influence and power.
So it's as though there's the Bretton Woods order, but actually by the 70s, it's been overlain by a more fixed order, something almost more reliable than that, which is a kind of friend-enemy Cold War order. And you can dispense with Bretton Woods because the other one is going to hold the thing together, which turns out to be a mistake. I mean, the oil shock shows in a way that that's a mistake, if that was the calculation.
Yeah, I mean, I think that what we're saying is simplifying it, so I don't know that that was an explicit calculation. All I mean to say is we need to also put on the table the reliance on the United States military as a global leader that's very powerful in this moment and sort of backstops everything else that Nixon believes he's doing.
So given what you've been saying, what Nixon's calculation was in 1971, how much of a shock then is it for him, for the Republican Party, for the political establishment in the United States, what happens in 1973? If the Great Terror in 1971 is rising oil prices, what happened in 1973 is a nightmare that they couldn't have imagined. It's sort of off the charts, isn't it, as a thing to fear as an incumbent politician?
Well, what they can't imagine, and this builds on what we were just discussing, is that the so-called oil weapon would ever be deployed. They can't imagine that. So the Saudi oil minister, they're saying, if you don't allow us to earn more for the oil that belongs to us and allow us more control in setting the price of that oil, we're going to not allow you to do what you've been doing for half a century, at least. And no one believes them. And certainly not Nixon, and no one in the very few, I should say, in the American foreign policy establishment believe that they will ever make good on their threat to withhold oil. And so that is, in fact, what comes as a shock to them, that they will deploy the oil weapon, which they say they're going to do. And of course, the context for this also is our Middle Eastern tensions between Israel and Arab countries and America's steadfast support of Israel in this moment. And that is what precipitates the actual crisis.
Again, this is probably simplifying it, but was the threat in a way, if you don't allow us to raise oil prices a certain amount, we will end up raising them a lot. So the American political establishment wouldn't allow a bit because the view was cheap oil is the foundation of our economy. The threat was if you don't allow some of this, you're going to get an awful lot more of it that you can handle. And they didn't believe that that was the threat that would be followed through.
Yes, and it's about two other important details, too. One is they didn't believe that OPEC had the power to raise prices. I mean, they just didn't believe that that was a possibility, that they would sort of independent from the Western oil companies, that they would try to actually exert the power of a cartel. They did not believe that.
And is that because they thought the cartel would break? I mean, did they just assume that someone would free ride on this?
Yes, and they also didn't believe the other threat, which was that they would just leave the oil in the ground. Because Nixon said, and I can't remember his exact quip, but oil in the ground is not worth anything compared to oil in the bank or something like that. I completely butchered that. But, that is the threat. They don't believe that they'll cut the spigot off. That is what the oil weapon is, just cutting it off.
With hindsight, it seems slightly naive to think that oil in the ground is not worth anything. Oil in the ground is worth something politically and economically, as they showed.
You're revealing our cultural differences, I think, by using slightly naive. That seems too polite. I mean, hubris, arrogance, again, all backed up by this idea that America is the greatest military superpower in the world. And who are these Arab sheiks? They're no one, like, how could they possibly threaten us?
These shocks happen at a particular time. It's October 1973. 6 months after the shock, where are we? I mean, for a start, we're in the middle of Watergate, so Nixon has got other things to worry about. But what has happened to the American economy? What has happened to oil prices? What has happened to the public view of their God-given right to cheap oil?
Well, there's a few ways to understand what's going on at this moment. So between October and March, really, when we sort of think of this first oil shock, part of what is shocking is that very few Americans understand the changing geopolitical reality that Americans are becoming increasingly reliant on imported oil. So not only have we depended on cheap oil, we have depended on American oil. Everybody knows about the Rockefellers and all of the sort of celebrated stories of discoveries in American oil fields and the sort of image of the Texas oil man. And so few Americans understand that in a very short period of time from the late 60s until 73, the amount of oil that Americans import doubles. I think I have that right. And so Americans believe that this is a phony crisis. So even though there are all of these geopolitical events happening, the Arab-Israeli war, Kissinger's shuttle diplomacy, all of this going on, Americans don't know and don't believe that we're importing oil from this region anyway. So all they're seeing are the consequences, which is prices rising at the pumps. And that, in a way, creates an extra problem, or perhaps the problem for Nixon, because most Americans believe that this is just sort of the greed of big oil. And so if that's what Americans believe, and then you're a politician who wants to not get blamed for any economic crisis, and you're a politician who's weakened because you've engaged in illicit things like Watergate, you're going to be extra determined to figure out how to make Americans less angry at the situation than they already are. And so it's in that context that Nixon, in effect, doubles down on price controls that ultimately actually don't really work, and certainly don't prevent long lines at the gas pumps and a sort of panic mentality.
A question that goes back to something that you said earlier, and it touches on something that we talked to Gary Gerstle about at some length, which is when you mentioned that Congress had passed the power to set these price controls to the president, and it's part of this long story of Congress giving up its ability to control these things and handing it over to the White House. Why? From the outside, it's one of the puzzles of American politics right up to today when we see what Trump is able to do, uncontrolled by congressional restraint or oversight. Why did Congress want to allow the president to have the ability to set wage controls or price controls?
So I think you have to start with the question, which is why price controls at all, which seems so un-American. And the answer to that is Americans were still that New Deal World War II generation. Nixon himself, even as he was an opponent of the New Deal, was of that generation. For that matter, Joe Biden is of that generation. Joe Biden's political worldview was sort of shaped when he first came into office, which was amid this first oil shock, okay? And from that perspective, Americans believed it was government's responsibility to take bold action to protect their pocketbooks. That's the short version of the New Deal story. That's the short version of policies during World War II, which front and center were price controls and rationing, which basically Americans saw as less of a restriction than a promise to prices they could afford, and through rationing, which again seems like a limitation, but really it was just a fair share for everyone. And that was sort of the mentality, which is why Congress passes this kind of measure in the first place. And yet, to your question now, why let the president be the one to trigger it? Well, there are restrictive elements, of course, about price controls. So let's sort of be the big shots and pass this bill, and then we'll also pass the buck on to the president here. But what's interesting, and to the larger point that I'm trying to make, is that it's not with that first bill, but in the midst of the oil shock, when they're trying to figure out what to do, and they pass a more intricate bill that allows for allocations, which is where the government's going to basically say what oil processors are going to get what amount of what kind of fuel, and when are we going to turn from the kind of fuel that we need in the winter to the kind of fuel that we need in the summer when more people drive, et cetera. And then we're going to let the government make these set of decisions. With that measure, rationing came fairly close to passing. The idea that we would all have ration booklets again in 1973 fell only 8 votes short. I mean, I know we live in a world now where every vote is just a matter of one person, but it didn't used to be that way. So the Democrats for a long time had a fairly large and fairly comfortable majority, and rationing came fairly close to passing, which again speaks to this idea of what Americans' expectations were of what government would do for them.
Given the other side of this was the desire not to be so reliant on imported oil, because after 73, it was clear that put America in a very vulnerable place. And it goes back to the earlier shock, this view that American energy self-sufficiency was a really important part of this equation. There needed to be more oil coming from the United States itself. One traditional way of doing that was to put tariffs on imports. But that's not an option here. So I'm not an economic historian, but tariffs had also passed out of the policymakers' handbook by this point. But it's also not going to work in the middle of an oil crisis because presumably it takes a long time to build up the capacity of domestic oil producers to meet that demand. The only thing that would happen with tariffs here is oil would get even more expensive.
Well, there's geological fact that we have to put on the table and then also political aspect of it. The geological fact was the very strong belief. The whole shale revolution exploded that, but the belief certainly was that we had reached peak production.
So it's not worth protecting an industry that had already dried up, basically.
Right. So that was very much a belief at the time. But what many around Nixon believed, just let prices rise, like that's what we do here. And if you get rid of these idiotic price controls, all of the gas lines will disappear overnight, plain and simple. And Nixon was unwilling to do that because he believed that would make him politically vulnerable.
So how did the two sides of American politics come to a different understanding of what to do in the aftermath of it? If you got people saying, no, this is the land of the free, we don't do this stuff, it'll all come out all right in the end. What were Democrats doing and saying, watching a Republican president impose price caps? They themselves come close to introducing rationing. Do they think in the end this is going to require more and more government intervention in the economy? Do we start to see the beginnings of that divide opening up?
Yeah, the story's complicated because as much as Nixon imposes these controls, he puts in place William Simon as the energy czar, who is a conservative ideologue. And so he talks very deliberately out of both sides of his mouth. So as he's imposing all of these kinds of controls, he tells the American public very deliberately that these are a disaster. So it's a crazy way of functioning, So you have in one singular person this tension, which is why Simon says, well, just use less. Then we don't have to have all of these controls. Just use less. Restrain yourself, and then we don't have to go down the road to serfdom as these conservatives believed the controls would take us. So it's a complicated moment. It's sort of interesting because historians don't write about the confluence of Watergate and the oil crisis, but they really are both playing out together in real time. And Watergate seriously is weakening Nixon, which is why he turns to these more heavy-handed measures. And yet at the same time, as Watergate accelerates, there's a funny political twist or shift that happens, which is Nixon becomes more reliant on conservative members of Congress. And so then he himself wants to back away from things that they despise, like controls. And it's ultimately Barry Goldwater, who's on the conservative end of things, who essentially calls it for Nixon, who goes and says to Nixon, "You're done." And so Nixon is out, and yet the world that he put in place lives on. Because who wants to be the politician that says this thing that is actually rather complicated, that economists and ideologues have very elaborate debates about, but seems very commonsensical to you people out there on the gas lines? We'll just tell oil companies they can't charge more. Who wants to be the politician that's going to say, oh, yeah, I'm not in favor of that? No one wants to be the politician who does that. And so, in fact, you don't have the Department of Energy until Jimmy Carter creates one when he comes into office, but you have the Federal Energy Administration. And that lives on. That outlives Nixon. And so Gerald Ford inherits that. And there really is this sort of tension because certainly if Americans don't fully appreciate the increasing vulnerability presented by OPEC and the oil shock of 73, the foreign policy establishment, which had initially never believed that these Arab sheiks would flex their muscles, they now fully understand that we're in a different universe. And so there's this tension that persists for the rest of the 70s between pleasing the American public who likes their cheap prices and the increasing dependence on insecure oil from abroad.
What's really interesting to me about the story you just told there is I completely get why who wants to be the politician who says to the American public, you want us to tell those rich oil barons to keep their prices down, but we're not going to do that. You don't want to be that politician. But who wants to be the politician, let alone the right-wing ideologue, who says to them, use less? From now, that seems like an equally unpalatable message. Politicians do not, on the whole, these days, get up and tell the public to use less, to be frugal. We associate that with environmentalists. We associate the environmentalist case being, in the end, we're going to have to rein ourselves in. The politicians, particularly of the right, never say that now.
We've talked about the speed limit, so that's already an imposition, right? But the way that many of these restrictions, appeals to restraint, the way that politicians sell them is about preservation. That is, if you make these small changes, if you dial down your thermostat a little bit, then we can go on living the life that, if you leave a room and you turn your light out, then we can basically have this indulgent suburban lifestyle centered around the automobile that you all know and love and expect. So it's a way of making small changes to preserve our overall lifestyle. That's how they're couched and framed, at least by the right. The left frames it differently. The left is more like, get rid of your car, ride bicycles, use a wood stove. And if you don't do these things, it's the end of the world. The left frames it that way.
That's not going to be a popular message.
No.
The first message seems to me to be deeply unconvincing. Here's this crisis that has been caused by geopolitical, international, and economic realities. But if you turn off a light switch, we'll be okay. That seems like an unconvincing message. The message from the left seems like a really, really unattractive message, which is wood stoves, bicycles, and, hemp garments or whatever it was.
And of course, cardigan sweaters. And so I think we can talk about Jimmy Carter because that is really when all of this comes together in the 1970s with Jimmy Carter sitting in front of the fireplace in a cardigan sweater, telling Americans, turn down your thermostat even more, wear a cardigan sweater, and you'll be okay. And the difference between Carter and Nixon is that Carter does push for a larger program that includes the creation of the Department of Energy, that includes a commitment to alternative fuels and that sort of thing, which Nixon doesn't really go for.
So if we talk about the Carter speech, these two speeches that bookend the decade, the Carter malaise speech, I don't think he ever used the word malaise, but it got that nickname because it was thought to be very depressing. Rereading the two speeches alongside each other, they seem in many ways to be telling the same story, but the Carter one, it's not a Nixonian speech. It's quite weird, the Carter one. It's a little bit sort of mystical in places. He goes off down slightly weird rabbit holes. It's got a far greater emphasis on restraint, like you suggest. It's more austere than the Nixon version. But it's also got this thing that was missing. This is what stood out to me when I read it from the Nixon version, which is if we want to be energy self-sufficient, we're going to have to do a heck of a lot of stuff at the government level to liberate alternative sources of fuel, to investigate the possibility of shale and all the rest of it. It seems very dated, this speech, and yet it also seems to contain within it the seeds of what is actually going to happen, which is a story that will lead within 3.5 decades to America becoming a net exporter again. It's a very unusual piece of political rhetoric, I think.
Well, it is. And I think just for context here, what is so important to understand about the Carter oil shock is that it was the second one, right? So when the oil shock happens under Nixon's watch, Americans are surprised, taken aback, and in disbelief because they don't know we import any oil at all. By the time the summer of 79 happens, Americans have been told that there is this energy crisis, and they have also been told by Jimmy Carter, who comes into office promising to solve the energy crisis. And here we are lining up again at the pump in these interminable long lines. This seems like an epic failure. It seems like an epic, epic failure. Carter overpromised and underdelivered in a major, major way around the thing that Americans cared the most about. And Carter, unlike Nixon, in this way, I believe they're very different kinds of presidents, truly believes that he has to actually solve the energy crisis, not just deal with the immediate political ramifications. And he believes that for a couple of reasons. One, he does believe that we are in a different world here where Americans are more vulnerable on the global stage, right? So, 1973, one question that no one was even really asking in a serious way is, okay, well, why didn't we just send a greater military presence to the Gulf region and tell these Arab countries, you can't boycott America? And we couldn't do that because this was also the time of diminishing power because of the failure in the Vietnam War. Flash forward to the Carter years, by now, the failure in Vietnam was pretty clear, and we were losing all kinds of perceived power on the global stage. And Carter understands that. Certainly, the foreign policy advisors around him understood that. And another motivator for Carter was conservation. He believed in that very, very deeply. He really did. And I would say a third motivation were his Christian values. Like, he just believed there's no reason for Americans to make themselves vulnerable, possibly harm the earth, so that they can indulge their wasteful ways. And that was the Sunday school teacher in Carter, and he really believed this. So he came into office in 1977 really promising that he was going to solve the energy crisis. And Carter was interesting. He was unlike Nixon and someone like Joe Biden. Carter was not that Nixon was a New Deal Democrat, but he came of age in that moment of the strength of the New Deal. Carter was a Southern peanut farmer who believed much more in market principles. So he was not a fan of controls himself. And because he believed that ultimately the solution was Americans should just use less, he also believed that it was okay if prices went up. That was deeply unpopular. And he believed that that would make Americans less vulnerable on the international stage. So he believes, and he ultimately does, I'll be the one who's going to take the political heat. I'm going to get rid of these price controls. I'm going to phase them out. And he would have just ripped the Band-Aid off and done it, but Congress was not really going to let him do it like that. So he has to go in this incremental way. And the problem is that when, in response to the unrest in the Middle East, in Iran, there's a reduction in global oil supply, and Americans find themselves on gas lines again, Carter has no credibility because he's promised to take care of this problem, and now this problem is worse than the last time that we went through this. So Americans are furious, are just absolutely furious. So not only are they facing long lines at the pump and rising prices, for the first time, gasoline becomes more than $1 a gallon, and we don't even have the right pumps to sort of display that price because we only have 2 slots, up to 99 cents, because no one can conceive that gas would ever be more than $1. I mean, it just wasn't part of the imagination. And there's just huge amount of anger. And what ends up happening is this failure of Carter's becomes exhibit A of why the government is ineffective. If Watergate and Vietnam taught Americans that government could not be trusted, then the energy crisis taught Americans that government didn't work. And to get back to the speech itself, that's just the sort of larger context. But to get to the speech itself, Carter believed that as people are furious, they have bumper stickers that say, Carter, kiss my gas on their cars. As they're just furious, he believes the only solution here is to just talk honestly to the American people.
Slightly naive.
Again, that phrase, slightly naive. But I think in this case, that's probably an apt description. And historians, scholars, environmentalists, they love this speech, the crisis of confidence speech. It's true that the word malaise, he doesn't use it in that speech, but all of his top aides and press spokespeople around the time of the delivery of that speech are using that phrase. And we haven't even talked about all of the inflation, that's going on in this period that further erodes trust and confidence in government. And Carter says, I'm going to go on TV. First, I'm going to do this big retreat at Camp David. And I'm going to summons all of these people and I'm going to get everyone's thoughts. And I'm going to really go deep into the American psyche and the American character and the American mindset. And he disappears. At the moment, it's over July 4th weekend, when people are like most pissed that they can't have the gas to go on their vacations and whatever. He's up in Camp David somewhere, and then he sort of comes down off the mountaintop and he delivers this speech. And academics and lefties and Marxists love this speech, because Carter was sort of telling it like it is. Americans, you have to cut back on your obscene consumer habits. But all of the people right around Carter, except the speechwriters thought this was like their shining moment kind of thing. They know this is a disaster. This is not what you do. This is not what you ever do. You don't blame Americans. You just don't do that. And yet that's how it came across. And so he just served up for Ronald Reagan, the perfect campaign issue in 1980, in which Reagan, again, used the energy crisis as exhibit A of why government is the problem, not the solution.
It feels like from the Nixon Shock speech to the Carter crisis of confidence / malaise speech, here was a decade in which, in their different ways, American presidents tried to tell the American public it's a dangerous world out there, it's volatile, we're vulnerable. To make ourselves more secure, it's kind of on us, and we're going to have to do something which may be quite tough, but we're going to have to show certain kinds of restraint or self-discipline. And that was tested to destruction, and the Carter speech is the destruction moment, at which point politicians effectively give up on that as a message, and we move into a new world. It's still a dangerous world. America is still vulnerable. It's an increasingly globally interconnected world. But America is not going to reestablish its security through self-discipline. It's probably going to reestablish its security just by getting richer and richer. Is it fair that it does mark a kind of watershed, that it does test to destruction the idea that in an increasingly interconnected world, the way to be safe is to be restrained? Politicians give up on that after 1979?
Well, it's not just the way to protect ourselves is by becoming richer and richer. The way to protect ourselves is to do so in a more conventional sense of this, which is we will militarize the Gulf. So that is what we see happening. And it's not that surprising, therefore, in 1991 that the solution is to send troops in a certain kind of way to that kind of crisis.
It's hard to imagine George H.W. Bush coming on TV and saying, Iraq has invaded Kuwait, so we're going to have to turn off the light switches.
Correct. And he comes by this perspective, honestly, as a former oil man himself, who decides, I'm not going to go to Wall Street and just do the obvious thing that Bushes would do. I'm going to go make it on my own, which of course is not quite true because he does use all of his connections to go make it on his own out in the oil fields. But he does understand all of the kinds of contradictions and dilemmas that we've been talking about, which is that it's becoming harder to drill in America, that we're becoming more dependent, that this is making America more vulnerable, and we have to figure out some kind of solution. So that is where his entry point is to this story that we've been talking about. It's interesting. So when Ronald Reagan comes in, the first thing that he does by executive order on day one is he rescinds all of the price controls that Nixon first put in place, and it's this sort of symbolic accomplishment. And he benefits somewhat because what ends up happening is, as a result of the very rapid increase in oil prices in the 70s, you do have the private sector sort of accommodating itself to more conservationist ways, something they had not thought about because it hadn't really been a big expense. But you do see an expansion of oil discovery in places like the North Sea and other regions, as well as an effort to be more efficient. You do see that also the production of more efficient automobiles. So you do see all of these changes that are happening. And by the mid 80s, when I say that Reagan kind of gets lucky, you do have a collapse of oil prices. That is, that OPEC overplays its hand, and we go from a shortage to a glut scenario, and you have a collapse of prices, to which Reagan says, you see, I told you the solution was less government. And that's how he sells it. And at the same time, we have the creation of a permanent military command in the Middle East. And so those are the key things that happen in the Reagan era.
You said that Nixon was a child of the New Deal order. Biden first came into office around the time of the oil crisis. I want to ask you about Trump now, because Trump and Biden are a very similar age. Trump was not a politician back then. In the 70s, he was making his way, supposedly, in business. He hadn't become a celebrity either in the 1970s. Is it too much of a stretch to think that that decade played a key role in his worldview as well? Because it sometimes feels like with Trump, he sees the whole global economic order as a conspiracy or a cartel or a plot against America, that these people are out there exploiting the system. So a bit like Nixon said in 1971, we're at the mercy of the speculators, but it's more than that with Trump. It's more paranoid and it's a more complete vision. It's almost more like he sees the international economy, as people came to appreciate OPEC was in 1973, that it did have the power, the cartel did have the power to hold. Given that Trump lived through that decade, was trying to start out as a businessman, do you think it shaped his worldview? Do we know what Trump's response was to the crisis of the 70s?
Trump's worldview is, if you're not a winner, then you're a sucker. That's Trump's worldview. And there's winners and there's losers. And what we do know is, for example, he thought Carter was a totally pathetic, weak president. And he thought that the hostage situation was a perfect example of American weakness. Trump never wants to be weak, and he certainly doesn't want to be weak on the global stage. And he's not necessarily interested in playing a role all the time on the global stage, but he would never want to appear weak. And so I think that the 70s did shape him, because if you see the world in that very basic winners and losers, America was a loser in the 1970s. Its prestige, its power, its ability to shape and influence markets diminished in the 1970s. And so that's powerful. And I think Trump has been talking about tariffs for a very long time. And that is not like a deeply held or reason. It's a deeply held, but it's not a deeply reasoned economic theory. I just read the interview last night that he gave to The Atlantic reporters. I don't know if you've had a chance to read that yet. And he just says, oh, tariffs, they're going to win. They're going to make us winners. Like just look at the trade deficits. And therefore, if you do that, it doesn't necessarily use the word therefore. Again, it's not that reasoned, but tariffs is the solution. And that's going to make America great again because we shouldn't be bullied around by foreign countries. He just believes that. And I believe that comes out of a very basic view of the 1970s, which is very much connected to energy crisis, which is this is when America was brought to its knees by some seemingly powerless Arab sheiks. And so, yeah, I think it did deeply shape him.
How much do you think of Trump's view is then reinforced by the fact that he is now president when the shale revolution has delivered? The United States has become, on some accounts, you can call it a form of energy self-sufficiency. Over the last decade, it has, for the most of that period, been a net exporter of oil and gas. The 1970s were such a shock because American politicians and then the public eventually discovered just how vulnerable the country was in a world in which it was a net importer and a massive net importer of oil. Trump has sort of inherited the fruits of that other part of Carter's speech. The 70s did see a lot of investment in these alternative sources of energy, and it did take decades, but it did pay off. And now America is a much, much more secure actor on the global stage in energy terms. Do you think that has, in a way, liberated Trump to believe the things that he does? We'll be a winner because, look, on this front, compared to the 70s, we've already shown that we're winning.
Yeah, the other way that the 70s shaped Trump, not just tariffs, but Trump has this weird connection to the oil industry. Like, he's a builder. Mainly, he thinks of himself, he's a builder and a negotiator, and mainly he thinks in physical sort of realities. Even tariffs, it's about physical stuff in a sort of way. But he is so much a believer in drill, baby, drill. I mean, he just loves that. And I think that also comes out of the 70s. So, yeah, shale, whatever. I mean, he's certainly not a fan of solar and wind. He does not like that. He just likes stuff coming out of the American ground. I know that sounds really basic, but I think that is his mentality. And he wants to now shrink the footprint of national parkland monuments and give it over to oil. So, that's just how he thinks of the world. And I do believe that that comes out of the 70s, because if we just rely on the stuff that we've always had and always been great at doing, we can dictate to the rest of the world.
It's sort of ironic, isn't it, where we started this conversation that in the early 70s, there was this belief that America had run out. The part of what became this crisis of confidence through the decade was this feeling we don't want to be dependent on the rest of the world, but we've kind of used up our resources. And if you're Trump, you presumably think that was just defeatism. And you presumably also think that you were proved right in a weird sort of way, that, the 1970s where people didn't have the faith that there was more stuff to be got, they were proved wrong. And people like him, who were the drillers, were proved right. I mean, I think it probably does lodge somewhere in his psyche that the 70s and what followed proves him right.
I think that that's right. And, just to go back to Carter for 1 second here, what Americans liked in the 70s, what Americans were open to in the 70s was this promise by Carter that we will figure it out. And one of the ways that Carter promised to figure it out was through solar energy. But the way that Americans understood solar energy is, yeah, sure, that seems great. There's the sun, it's free. And okay, if you're going to figure that out for us, fine. We're not going to change anything about our lifestyles. And what do you mean we have to invest major government funds in this alternative industry? That's not what people were talking about. Carter promised them by the year 2000, we'd get 20% of our energy needs from the sun. And that power would be so cheap, we wouldn't have to meter it. That's always been the promise of every new power source, whether that's oil or nuclear or solar or whatever. So I think you're right that the lesson that Trump takes from the 70s is that he's been proven right? We were on this other trajectory where the lesson from the 70s was that we were proven right in the need to shift to new kinds of energy sources through which we would gain our independence. And I don't mean shale, I mean all kinds of renewable energy sources. And the guy who is not elected, who stands next to Trump all the time, Elon Musk, he was making that bet too through his electric cars, So it's just this weird moment where you can take any story you want out of the past. But I think you're right that Trump is taking the story that it's just a matter of getting government out of the way, and then more oil will come out of the ground and everything will be fine.
Next time, it's the last episode in this mini-series. I'm going to be talking to Dani Rodrik, who is in many ways the guru of what's gone wrong with globalization, about what's gone wrong with globalization. We've also got coming up very soon a bonus episode on PPF Plus, in which I'm going to try and answer some of the questions that we've had about this series. Part of the PPF Plus package is subscriber-only Q&A, so if you would like to hear that, along with all of our bonus episodes and ad-free listening, just sign up now, either by clicking on the link in the show description or by going to our website, ppfideas.com, and joining there. That's coming very soon, and in our regular slot after Dani Rodrik, we've got something new for you, a new series, and I'll tell you all about that next time. This has been Past, Present, Future, part of the Airwave Podcast Network.